Racism and racist backlashes are cyclical. People of color know that because we often, feel that when things seem to be going well, we're sort of half waiting for the other shoe to drop. A lot of folks in the various Asian communities are experiencing this backlash right now. The feeling is, oh, this again. By learning from the fact that these things rear up over and over again, you can possibly get ahead of it. When it does happen, you can already have expected it to happen and to respond to it. You are part of also a history of resistance that carries on from the past right up to now. Resistance is an ongoing project, and it has to be something that also renews itself and is also there in the down times. Take the time to learn.
Maong yaagawad kayo namin. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Good afternoon. My name is JP Catungal. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I'm an assistant professor in the Social Justice Institute at UBC, as well as interim director of the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program, also at UBC. I'm one of your co-moderators for today's session. And I'm speaking to you as a first-generation Filipinx migrant settler, streaming live from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Grayson?
Hello, my name is Grayson. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto and a member of the Asian Canadian Living Archive and Giant Doma Collective, and also a member of Hung Coalition. I'm speaking as a second-generation Korean ethnic migrant settler based in Toronto.
Just a couple of quick words before we go into the report back from the breakout sessions. I'll invite Grayson to get us started on talking about and centering wellness and care as central to the work that we're doing today.
So let's name very explicitly that the issues we've been hearing about and discussing today and tomorrow as well are not just conceptual issues. They are also, for most of us, our lives, histories, cultures, and embodied experiences. In other words, this is intimate and personal, and we experience anti-Asian racism in multiple and different ways. Given the complicatedness, differentiation, and intersectional of Asian as a category, these conversations can thus be challenging and taxing in ways that are shaped by these intersectional realities.
So we want to foreground health and wellness as a key component of the practice of doing this work. And I'd like to remind each of us to engage in this conversation and other conversations that will be taking place today and also tomorrow, and in the ways that you understand to be best for you. I'm reminded of the words of one of my heroes, someone that Minal Matani in a previous session also quoted, the Black lesbian feminist writer, poet, and activist Audre Lorde, who has powerfully talked about the importance of taking care of oneself in a white supremacist world that is actively hell-bent and designed to kill or to maim BIPOC people. And she says, and I quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." So we invite you to step away or take a break as you need. Please go ahead and do so. There are also active listeners available if you need to debrief in the moment or want to have a wellness conversation. And you can find the Zoom information to access active listeners and also some resources on the Feed Loop lobby. Please consult them as needed. So I also wanted to, as I said, give us some context for the kind of continuation of the conversation, to draw out some key lessons from the panels today that hopefully you took with you in your breakout discussions. And these include, for me, the insistence that anti-Asian racism in the last year has a long history. It's not something that just reared its head in the last year. There is a long history to this in the Canadian context. The name of Project 1907, we heard from Ellen Kay, who is involved with Project 1907. The very name speaks to and reminds us of how, what's happening today, the racism that we have been experiencing in the last year is certainly tied to and embedded in this much longer history of anti-Asian racism from at least over a century ago. That anti-Asian racism is also not just the spectacular forms of violence and the key moments often identified in public and institutional and media conversations. They also take place in the kind of quieter moments, institutional arrangements, things that we just take for granted as just the way things are. These are, anti-Asian racisms that are baked into systems and discourses and institutions, not just individual forms of hate. And I'd like to recall the words that Lara Honrado mentioned earlier, and she's one of our report back speakers today in this session. She said earlier that, part of this work is that we interrogate not only who is and isn't at the table, but what the history of the table is at all. Whose labor, on whose backs the table has been constructed. And we've heard from several people today that anti-Asian racism must be approached with full recognition as well of its intersectional manifestations and effects and its entanglement with anti-Blackness, anti-Indigeneity, and cis-heteronormativity, among other ongoing and concurrent issues.
In the concurrent breakout discussion sections, discussants and panelists were asked to consider these lessons along with following questions in relation to their specific sectors. How has anti-Asian racism manifested, both in terms of the contemporary moment and as a consequence of historical structures? What are priorities for what needs to change in order to combat and eliminate these impacts? And finally, who needs to be convinced or involved to act in order to make the necessary changes?
So the goal of these breakout sessions today and the report backs is, again, to offer us some important starting points that will take us at least partly to tomorrow's discussion, which will be centered on the kind of the specific asks, our visions for the future, our desires, and what opportunities and barriers exist at the moment that shape how we proceed forward. And so I'd like now to invite each of the session representatives to report back on the conversations that each of you had in the sessions that you were a part of. And we'll start with Violet from the education session, if you don't mind.
Thanks, everybody. My name is Violet Tsai, and I'm speaking from the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe, Mohawk, Algonquin, and St. Lawrence Iroquois, also known as Ottawa. So the education panel had a very fruitful discussion addressing the 3 questions. So for number 1, how has anti-Asian racism manifested in K-12 education and post-secondary education, both in terms of the contemporary moment and as the consequence of historical structures? So someone had brought up a very good point. A lot of the education structures that we currently take part in, and a lot of the curriculum that we abide by is created by these Eurocentric ideas, Eurocentric curricula, and it is important to be breaking down the Eurocentric idea as well as the assimilated norms of what students are expected to learn in school. For the second question, what are priorities for what needs to change in order to combat and eliminate these impacts? There was a lot of discussion about this topic. Namely, one person brought up an interesting quote, in order for me to teach you, I must know you. So this calls for greater representation in the staffing that we see in schools. This calls for reducing the amount of gatekeeping we see in academia, especially in higher education. Someone had mentioned that in spite of the fact that K-12 education is moving along quite quickly in becoming more culturally aware, sensitive, higher education, post-secondary education is quite slow and is still quite behind in these regards. And who needs to be convinced or involved to act in order to make the necessary changes? Of course, it starts with forums like this, starts with identifying these issues, really bringing these issues to light, and then identifying the key stakeholders and who are the people who create our education systems, who are the people who perpetuate our curriculum, our syllabi. And then some key highlights just to wrap up is, so making the hiring process and also teacher education. So when people are training to become teachers, for them to recognize their role as an authoritative figure, that many young people will be taking every word that comes out of their mouth as fact. So it is so important for them to have gone through sensitivity training, cultural training. Furthermore, school trustees need to be held accountable. The trustees should really be reflecting the community in which they are serving and should be held accountable. And finally, our last highlight is that it's so important for BIPOC voices and scholars to have a priority in course syllabi. So often we see university course syllabi only having these alternative or BIPOC voices at the very end of the term, just kind of a glimpse of an alternative idea of the course outline, whereas the entire course might be made up of traditional methods or traditional ideas. It's important to dismantle this, or else we will be perpetuating the Eurocentric education system that exists.
Thank you very much, Violet. I'm going to turn it over to our second reporter, Stephanie from the health session.
Thank you. So again, my name is Stephanie. I'm reporting from the health panel. And two of the major highlights on our panel, highlight number one was that representation matters. So there needs to be a greater diversity of voices at all levels of health, not just in frontline workers, but in administration and leadership. We discussed how in health education, there needs to be a push for greater representation of marginalized folks and encouraging health providers to be candid about burnout and other mental health outcomes that result from racism. We also discussed the model minority myth and the pressures of meritocracy in health education and teaching institutions that have made this hidden curriculum adding a barrier to Asian Canadians and other minority populations and immigrants from progressing in the healthcare system and becoming leaders, also related to the phenomenon known as the bamboo ceiling. The second highlight in our panel was also in regards to patient care. So needing a shift towards culturally competent care that's not based on stereotypes and involving the community. So greater community engagement, getting rid of the Western standards that are baked into our health system, which is predominantly based on the biomedical model, embracing cultural norms. We also spoke on greater funding for our communities in mental health and also in general in health for translators, having translated materials, not just relying on the unpaid labor of family members for people to receive culturally competent and compassionate care in the health system. And again, just allocating resources, the aggregation of data to help us create these environments and take action. I'm going a little bit backwards. So I went with the highlights first. For the three questions that we discussed, we did tweak them a little bit to sort of be more specific to the healthcare context. So the first question, we spoke about how racism's relationship to health is. So in this question, we spoke about, we started with just kind of the individual experience from one of our student panelists about the model minority myth, and how representation, again, matters in our communities, but the difficulty of finding an Asian therapist and mental health. And then we escalated to the social determinants of health and discussed the healthy immigrant effect, or the phenomena of populations arriving to Canada and there being a negative impact on their mental and physical health. And from there, we went deeper into the roots of structural racism and health. And in terms of suggestions for the future, we discussed a lot of mentorship and support. Funding is the big part, because a lot of our Slido questions in the panel were related to how we can uphold our voices, how we can have more representation, how we can have more Asians and other BIPOC members enrolling in the health education and being a part of the health professional system. And yeah, that pretty much summarizes our panel.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I wanted to follow up and see if the subject of anti-Blackness and inherent difficult or problems and clashes with the Indigenous community in Canada's healthcare system, if those topics came up at all, and in addition, LGBTQ issues seem to be quite related to a lot of problems within healthcare. If we think about, for example, the AIDS crisis that occurred right in Canada as well, and so I was wondering if this became a subject also within your panel. Yeah, just wanted to check up on those three things, I guess, if any of those subjects came up and what the conversation was like.
Yeah, that's a great question, Grayson. Just jump in there if I missed something. I think you spoke to the LGBTQ plus community and also the anti-Black sentiment. And sorry, what was the third one?
Indigenous.
Indigenous? Okay. We really just sort of scratched the surface. I don't think we really, looking over our notes as well, went into it directly. We did have a question towards the end on our Slido about a incident at UBC that was related to, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not from BC, so I may not have the facts straight, but I did read about this. An incident at UBC with a student who I believe their partner had called for a wellness check, and security or police had shown up. Yes, thank you. Someone gave me the name Mona Wang. So we sort of started to scratch the surface on that topic of well, because they're all adjacent really, but it was towards the end of our session and we didn't get to dig into it.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I mean, yeah, it was a lot to deal with in a pretty short amount of time for all these issue tables with quite a few names to each of them. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done. I'll call upon Abigail, who was in the justice system breakout session, to report back next.
Thanks, Grayson. I'm speaking to you from the city of Vancouver, and I'm thankful for the ability to live, learn, organize, and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Our panel focused on three main themes and ways that anti-Asian racism manifests in the justice system. First, we looked at the lack of Asian Canadian representation in the legal system. We started with a discussion about the judicial appointment system and the need to expressly and explicitly acknowledge racial diversity as something that's needed on the bench and in the court system. Comments were made about how the lived experiences of racialized people can influence and impact the outcome of court cases and decisions, and the dearth of representation is doing a disservice to the broader Canadian community. We also talked about the impacts of the history of racism and discrimination and exclusion. One of those impacts is the lack of mentors for people seeking mentorship and wanting to be promoted and advanced within the legal system. This puts a bit of a burden on racialized people, including Asian Canadians, to work hard to increase mentorship, confidence, and transparency, demand those things from the people who are involved in making these appointments or promoting individuals within the Canadian legal system. There was the desire for the burden to not just be on racialized people, but also on the people in charge of the appointment system, but also a recognition that having community organizations such as the South Asian Bar Association or the Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers was important to promote diversity within the legal profession. We also talked a little bit about statistics and the need to have demographic data to measure where we are currently, and as well as where we're falling short, and ensure that our experiences cannot be minimized or denied. But we are also hopeful that with the increasing number of racialized lawyers, there may be some improvement in the area of lack of Asian Canadian representation in the legal system. On the second theme, we talked about the difficulty with reporting and prosecuting hate crimes, as well as the need to develop alternatives. One speaker shared his experience and difficulty with reporting a hate crime after being subjected to it, and particularly the language barriers to reporting a hate crime in Vancouver. Another speaker described the process for prosecuting hate crimes and the high standard for the burden of proof, as well as the pros and cons associated with having that high standard. She also described the difficulty of prosecuting racist incidents that are less than hate crimes, such as microaggressions, and what some of the impacts of that are on members of the Asian Canadian community. Another speaker spoke about the alternatives to pursuing anti-Asian racism within the criminal system. There's a recognition that law is a rather blunt tool at times, and one size does not fit all, particularly with a community as diverse in terms of its membership as the Asian Canadian community. So we looked at some alternatives and why people might be accessing other community initiatives outside of the formal criminal justice system, and how there's a need for government funding of those programs to better support them. And finally, our last theme was talking about challenges with community lawyering, including accessing funding and connecting with the community, particularly during COVID. We talked about the gap in access to justice for members of the Asian Canadian community. We talked about how it can be difficult to apply for funding when you don't have resources, and yet that undermines the ability to do that work. We also talked about moving community lawyering online and how that has been an effective way to reach people during COVID, but also required some flexibility. And we also talked about how community lawyering can be an effective way to lift the voices of even just individuals. One person making a suggestion can lead to real change. For example, with creating the Reporting Hate online toolkit. So it's great to see those initiatives promoted and having certain voices lifted. Thanks.
I have a follow-up question, Abigail, and this relates also to a conversation from a previous report back, which is around the politics of policing, and particularly lessons that have been offered by the movement for Black Lives, for example, around caution, around the kind of expansion of police powers. Particularly as responses to hate and violence, and also in light of the anti-Muslim attack in London, Ontario. Also some caution from members of activist communities about how calling something like that terrorism or a hate crime can also reproduce a history of those terms actually like attaching to bodies of color, BIPOC bodies particularly. And so it also could lead to, the expansion of police violence, policing as an institution more broadly that has a long history of being a tool for marginalization. So is that something that came up in the discussions that you had?
Absolutely. It was acknowledged by one of our speakers who spoke about, particularly in the wake of the Atlanta massacre, how many Asian and migrant sex worker advocates publicly reaffirmed their opposition to policing and the stigmatizing of sex workers. And the same speaker made the point that reporting to the police and pursuing prosecution can often be lengthy, costly, and re-traumatizing. So there was by no means a unified endorsement of one method here of reporting and prosecuting hate crimes. I think it was a broader discussion, but a range of views and multiple ways that we can see advancing responding to racism using the law or alternatives.
Thanks, Abigail. I'll call on Sibo next to speak from the Media Arts and Culture table.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Grayson. So the panelists for our panel comes from all over Canada, and I want to start by acknowledging, the Indigenous lands hosting us. So our panel slightly revised the 3 questions being asked. So we start by talking about power and politics in both media, arts, and the culture sectors. And then we discuss what need to be changed. And we end with the question, who should be engaged in, this kind of conversation toward systemic changes. So I will try to summarize our discussions in 3 keywords. So the first keyword is story. Again and again, we hear from the panelists talking about the importance of stories, be it, a story on news reporting, a story studied on social media discussion, or, a story has been told in, media productions. Story matters, and the key question is what kind of story are being told, and what kind of story that what kind of alternative stories we need to tell. And we need to ensure that, story coming from the community and are being told to the community. We need kind of changing the dominant narrative in different media channels that in many cases reinforcing systemic racism and anti-Asian racism. So on that point, we move on the second keyword, which is voice, right? So this kind of story, not only in terms of representation, but more important is who these kind of stories are empowering voices. And one particular point that has been raised by several panelists from our session is about, we need to be aware of extractive practices of Asian communities' stories, right? So especially the dominant mode of media production in Canada, in many cases, that is dominated by white power. And as a result, stories are taken away from marginalized communities. So in that regard, when we are creating this kind of alternative ways of telling stories, we must ensure that, the content being created are generative, encouraging, constructive, and working toward the goal of decolonization and racial justice. So that brings us the third keyword, which, multiple people here sharing their friend have mentioned is about funding. So we need more funding to fund marginal communities' cultural practices. We need more funding to support media stories that actually sharing different views that kind of deconstruct the stereotypes that is prevalent currently in the public sphere. And more importantly, we need to move further to really see that who is sitting in those funding bodies and who are making decisions in terms of, the funding distributions on, those kind of very important decisions for, media and cultural production. And for that purpose, we need actually working toward, this is mentioned in the morning panel, we need to work toward coalition building and working toward actionable commitments. I think that kind of set the goal for, tomorrow's conversation. Okay, so I'm just passing the virtual mic back.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sibo. There's a lot to cover there, and maybe I'll flag a couple of things. One is around funding institutions and who gets to make decisions and based on what priorities and how they're shaped, for example, by ideologies like multiculturalism or capitalist kind of priorities. Clearly, things we are not going to be able to solve in this session, but worth putting on the table so that they're on our radar as we continue our conversation today and also tomorrow. Our next reporter back is Karen Kobayashi from the Housing, Social Services, and Elder Care kind of Frankenstein session. Multiple sectors. Go ahead, Karen.
Thanks. Thank you, JP. Everything but the kitchen sink. And we actually overlapped, I think, quite a bit with the health panel. They had seniors care, and we were speaking about elder care in the context of housing and social services. So before I begin my summary, I'd like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territories I am speaking to you from this afternoon, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. We had a wonderful sort of what I would call mix of not-for-profit leaders as well as academics. We were hoping to have Isabel McKenzie, the director of the Office of the Seniors Advocate in the province, but she was unable to make it today. So we were also hoping to have government representation, but we will make sure that Isabel hears the recommendations that we made this afternoon. There were two key session highlights, and then I'll get to the three questions. We talked a lot, and this came up certainly from the not-for-profit, the immigrant settlement service providers, that social services and housing services are provided by community-based organizations like clan societies. And these societies receive little to no funding for providing these services. They are so dependent on donor funds. They are dependent on small pots of funding from different levels of government. And it's very difficult, we heard, for frontline workers, for staff to keep, and volunteers to keep up with the demand for these services. So of course, there's going to be, that what I think Sibo referred to as, what do we need? We need more resources. We need more funding to support the provision of these services in housing and the social service sectors. Elder care is inherent to both of these sectors. It starts from the top. We were talking about government policies, federal and provincial government policies, practices, and funding. And we just cannot continue to rely on grassroots organizations and communities to keep providing this kind of funding. It's really on the backs of low-waged workers and volunteers. The second highlight is that Asians are the most visible, we know, are an extremely visible population in Canada, yet they are invisible oftentimes in social services, in that we know that culturally appropriate care is essential, and culturally centered care is essential, but it's not provided well. It's provided piecemeal in long-term care, in community-based settings, et cetera. I believe, I can't remember who referred earlier, I think it was actually with Stephanie, you were talking about the model minority myth as being a challenge. This came up as well in our session. The model minority myth as erasing or neglecting, dismissing an Asian Canadian experience, or the experiences of Asian Canadians, sort of homogenizing that experience. And whereas, where those who are in need of social services, those who are in need of long-term care services or elder care services are not recognized as people who are actually in need. So that's something that also came up. You know, in response to the three questions, the first question, I just want to throw out a few of the core concepts or themes that came out. The first theme was intersectionality, and intersectionality as it relates not only to, you know, that sort of what we call in sociology as the holy trinity, right, of gender, class, and ethnicity, but also immigrant and immigration status, which are different, being foreign born versus Canadian, but also immigration status, a category under which one has come to Canada. And that matters. And our student representative, Leland, also spotlighted disability, and because that's her area of research. And she talked about the need to sort of understand that with an intersectional lens. We talked about structural violence. We talked about the ways in which our communities have been victims of systemic racism and structural violence for generations. And we talked about sort of the experiences of precarity and vulnerability that older adults in our communities and their caregivers have experienced time and time again in community-based as well as residential care settings. The second question, so what do we need to do? What are some of the priorities? Number one, and it came up time and time again, was that we know that funding is so heavily dependent on the collection of race-based data and research, both quantitative and qualitative, but that it is so important in order to access resources that we have the kind of data that we would be able to provide as evidence that there is a need, that there are significant needs in our communities. There is a need for, another priority was more equitable funding support across communities, larger investments in capacity building. Again, that goes back to that first highlight I was speaking about, where we talk about that much of the work is being done at the grassroots level and with little to no funding, so that so many volunteers and frontline workers who are under-resourced are burning out. So that's something that we spoke about as well. I took so many notes. The other piece is the other important piece is what is the role of allies, of white allies, in the work that we're doing. And we had several social workers on our panel who talked about the role of allyship, or the importance, of allyship in disciplinary settings like social work and nursing, and what we need to do, how we can work together. So these are some solutions that we hope to flesh out, of course, tomorrow. Who needs to hear this? Who needs to be involved? This is a multi-sectoral, transdisciplinary, multi-level task, or initiative that needs to take place. Queenie Chu, who is the CEO of one of the largest, actually I think it is the largest social service organization, Canada Success, she in an ethnocultural community, she talked about the need to around housing, to bring CMHC to the table, to bring BC housing to the table. But not only that, to bring older adults, like bring the voices of older adults and their caregivers and their families into the conversation, because they're often left out. And I think that's really important. And it's one of the key goals, right? When we think about, as researchers, we think about what is good knowledge mobilization. It starts with the communities that we are trying to support. We need to work with them from the beginning, throughout the development of appropriate and culturally centered interventions and program development. And so I think, and then the last point I think I want to make is around, it was just a really poignant, I think, remark that Monica Batak from, who's a Filipina Canadian researcher in Montreal, she said, we need to acknowledge and have us all acknowledge in our families, communities, workplaces, in our institutions that racism exists, that anti-Asian racism exists, and that's not up for dispute. We need to dig deeper to understand and really accept the fact that white supremacy as a system or a structure, it exists in all of us. It contributes to what Doris Chow was talking about, who's a community organizer on the downtown east side, what Doris Chow refers to as internalized racism. So, and the construction of that. And I know Kenneth Fung talked about that this morning. So in the context of mental health. So I'll leave it there. There was just so much because we had 3 sectors to cover. But we have lots of wonderful notes, and I thank my panel, and I thank the student note taker for taking such, for taking such detailed notes for us today.
Thank you so much, Karen. There is a lot there, and it resonates with quite a lot of the things that have already also been said around the importance, for example, of attending to intersectionality, to issues of precarity within the category Asian. And I think on that last bit with what Monica, you mentioning Monica's argument, I'd like to extend it further by inviting us to think about these issues also transnationally, because some of those issues, and I'm thinking here, for example, of American Empire in the Philippines, Spanish Empire in the Philippines, my community, right? These, the long ripple effects of these histories, ongoing ones, follow us here. They don't. They live in our bodies, and so we take them with us here in the diaspora as well, and those have effects in terms of the ways that we think about and organize against anti-Asian racism. So I wanted to mention that as well. I'll call on the next session reporter, Lara Honrado from the Government Policy and Political Representation session.
Hi, everyone, and salamat, JP. I moderated the breakout session on government policymaking and political representation. There were speakers who, from the federal and provincial levels, all elected to office, some from the governing party and some from the official opposition. So in that way, it was, I think, a good complement of different voices in government now. It was a very, I thought, very civil conversation. Each of the speakers managed to leave overt partisanship at the door, at the virtual door to the session, which I think was helpful for trying to get some more candid feedback. We didn't adhere to the 3 questions as they were laid out, in part because of the positions of power and influence that the panelists are in and hold with respect to actions that need to be taken to address anti-Asian racism. There were some common threads, similarly to what other panelists and other moderators were sharing around representation, and then Did I just lose everybody? No, maybe not.
No, you're here.
Okay, sorry. I just had a weird technical glitch. My apologies. Similar threads around representation, and each of the panelists, talked about how it's important not to consider any of our communities or our overarching communities as a monolith. Again, I think those are common threads that a lot of us were already aware of, and it was already shared, but it's different to hear that from elected officials, I think. That isn't always able to be articulated or acknowledged. So I found that to be something that was constructive and useful. I asked as an opening question of the panelists what their thoughts or comments were around this notion of like the construction of an Asian Canadian political identity, and whether or not a quote unquote Asian vote or Asian Canadian vote is that a thing? Does that exist? I don't think they were expecting that, but they had a little bit of time to consider their responses. I would say that the answer was both yes and no to that. That to me is something that I think is worth exploring. For those of us who are outside of partisan politics, but also for those who are engaged in partisan politics. Again, there was a little bit of pushback on that notion, but also the acknowledgement that, it's also something that is real in the way that that electorally people approach, campaigns. And how that manifests with newcomers and with later generations. And again, the sort of theme of tokenism. And keep in mind that all of the panelists as elected officials, are racialized, would probably consider themselves under this identity of Asian Canadian, and then the specificity of each of their identities, beyond that. There were questions from the audience about concrete action beyond platitudes. And what that looks like and what that should look like, which brought up questions around accountability, which is something that a number of the panelists returned to as well. One of them even saying, like, please continue to hold me and your elected officials accountable. I think there's something to be continued in that thread of the conversation as well. We also talked a little bit about, while this came up over and over again, representative diversity, but what that means as well in the public service and the role that especially senior public servants play, often, behind the scenes and behind closed doors in policymaking and in implementation. And what one of the questions touched on specifically was the lack of diversity and representation in the public service, and what different provincial and federal leaders have said about that or not said about that. And then, there were some reminders about the importance of remaining politically engaged and politically active, and being consistent about that. And then one of the other panelists also, talked about, as someone who is now an elected official, the recognition that the racism that is ongoing has been and continues to be in some ways, enshrined in laws and legislation. And she sort of talked a little bit about what does it mean to try to dismantle that as somebody who sits in the legislature. And I think that applies obviously at every level of government, all across the country. So those were some of the threads that came about in the conversation. I don't know that I have too much more to add there, unless there are particular threads that people are curious about.
Thanks so much, Lara. I was actually going to ask, I wonder if in the discussion, did the discussion ever kind of take a step back to consider the framework and the foundations of the Canadian state itself, whether it's embedded in colonialism foundationally and is still to this day embedded in ongoing foreign imperialism struggles as well?
Grayson, it never came up. Nobody addressed that. It didn't, that language was not used. I think, the closest that it got, again, were the references to the ways that anti-Asian racism, being excluded from say, voting rights, had been enshrined in laws and in legislation. That's the closest that it got. That language wasn't used in the discussion at the moment anyway. I think that had I or someone else used that language, I think at least some of the panelists might have been able to respond to that. But it's a good question.
Great, thanks so much, Lara. Maybe we can think about it for tomorrow to add some more conversations and spice it up a little bit. I'd like to call on the next person to report back. It'll be Carol Liao, speaking on economic issues.
Thank you, Grayson. Hi everyone. I'm Carol Liao, and I am speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. As Grayson said, I'm reporting back on the Economics, Employment, and Business panel. Admittedly, a topic that holds an enormous amount of power in our society, very influential power levers. And we had a very lively discussion on those three questions. And we actually had a really great cross-section of speakers discussing it in the context of structures and dismantling those structures, and also others on how to deal with racism within those structures to advance into leadership and power roles. And so first with the question, how has anti-Asian racism manifested in terms of the contemporary moment and as a consequence of historical structures? We really wanted to situate how we got here, and we talked about how, we over 175 anti-Asian laws that were implemented in this country that were designed to ensure a white majority and white supremacy, and saw this version of Asian peoples as subhuman, abstract labor and racial capital. And, and this structural racism, it manifests across Canada through economic disparity. One panelist talked about how the poverty rate in Canada for the white population is 12%, yet poverty rates for Chinese is 23%, Southeast Asian is 17%, Korean is 32%. And another panelist talked about how, racism is really this mechanism for political leaders to use to divide people and complete agendas, and it's poverty, not necessarily unemployment. That's the root cause of systemic racism from the economic perspective, and that corporations are really normalizing sort of inhumane conditions for laborers with low pay. And, so as we derive, 75% of our income from employment, the racialization of poverty is directly linked to structural racism within the labor market. Now, it's also, and since the pandemic, actually, how unemployment rates have increased sharply for all racial groups, including Asian, East Asian, South Asian, and Southeast Asian peoples. And so it was interesting to sort of have that discussion, right? Talking about, the perpetuation of these structural inequalities from our institutions, but then also talking about it within the institutions and how we see racial devaluation, the bamboo ceiling, and these things that are prominent. The model minority myth we talked about quite a bit too, and how it has really been used as leverage by those in power to ensure, the status quo is working just fine, right? And that, but on the other hand, and suppressing other racial groups, and then also making those that have been, that broke some barriers to feel immense pressure to overperform and stay accepted. And also there's not really any room for any error. And so, then we had, so there was that discussion on those particular challenges and the fact that leadership isn't being represented across the corporate sector in a lot of ways. Some were more optimistic that things are starting to change, but on the other hand, if you look at a lot of the statistics, I mean, less than 6% of board seats are held by racialized people. You're not seeing the huge transformation necessarily in senior management across Canada. And I mean, again, there were others that felt like, things were starting to change, and, that there was a lot of potential there. But then there was also some that felt actually they were sick of waiting, right? Like they felt enough with the corporate discretion, right? Like in this voluntary, like you're good for you, but there's a lot of companies that have diversity policies, and yet it is not reflected in their senior leadership teams, in their actions. And, so it's really about holding those people accountable. So that really then delves into the second question on priorities for change, right? And so with that sort of, not difference of opinion, but kind of just saying, it's a multifaceted question that requires a bunch of different angles on it. There is, the encouragement and fostering corporations to change and society change. But then on the other hand, one of the panelists was saying, I think we just need some laws to make this happen. We need quotas. We also need government policies to change. We need the Federal Employment Equity Act, which has in the past proven effective in bringing racial diversity to the workplace. We need to sort of put pressure on politicians and the lawmakers to incite this change. And while having those corporate executives continue to have these discussions and demand, and that we demand this change from the private sector, there was a big emphasis also from one panelist on the importance of education and awareness and consciousness raising. But really in terms of the third question on who needs to be convinced, I mean, again, it was more like, well, it's holding those people in power accountable for their actions, and that we can't just wait for corporate actions because it's not going to come soon enough and government has to step in. And also collecting race-based data was important as a useful sort of next step, and increase and ensure enforcement of employment standards, especially for precarious jobs. I think it was really also about how we need to put our money where our mouth is, and hold those people that are talking about these things to actually follow up with action. So I think I'll leave it there, but it was a really helpful discussion, I think, on identifying a lot of the problems in the sector, both from a structural level, but also within, those holding those in those structures accountable to increase diversity, and also come up with combat a lot of those biases. And we talked a lot about how, there's this predominant bias that Asian people, that Asians are great as subordinate, employees, great for technical jobs, but are regarded as unqualified to be leaders and managers. And so this racial devaluation and this bamboo ceiling is just quite prevalent and needs to be addressed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carol. I appreciate it. One thing that came up for me is that in the last year, we've witnessed the kind of rise of the figure of the essential worker as a specific kind of economic subject. And now all of a sudden we've discovered the capacity for us to be flexible around recognition of foreign credentials because of COVID. Now, foreign trained doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers.
Yeah.
Now some flexibility because of the need. And there's also now been some flexibilization around migrant workers who work in agriculture and meatpacking, for example. So all of a sudden, there's perhaps an opening to talk about how these things that we just take for granted as policies there's actually a possible kind of moments for shifts that could happen in relation to these longstanding issues, for example, around recognition of credentials and citizenship status and precarity. For example, I thought I'd mention that and also make linkages to our next speaker who will be talking about grassroots organizing and coalition building, where I imagine these things also might have come up.
Yeah, and if you want me, I'm happy to bring up some of the points from one of our panelists that did raise this, talking about how the pandemic has really broadened public awareness of the essential low-paid frontline work provided by people with precarious status, many of whom are racialized, and yet the vast majority are shut out of the new pathway to permanent residence programs announced by Canada last month, right? And so, kudos to this panelist too, who actually had quite a few targeted reform proposals, right? Strengthening the Federal Employment Equity Act, adopt similar legislation in all provinces and territories, making sure there are community benefit agreements attached to all federal investments to create equal jobs opportunities for Asian Canadians, and pushing for this pathway to permanent residence for all people in the precarious status. So definitely a real live and relevant issue. So thank you, JP.
Thanks so much, Carol. I'll call upon Kimberley now to speak on the grassroots organizing and coalition building issues table.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Kimberley Wong. I use she and they pronouns interchangeably. So we started speaking about the importance of coalition building and ways to engage allies, bridging groups, and then moved on to more specific issues of access, barriers, and capacity building of grassroots organizing, and finished with talking about embedding feeling and emotion into our movement building and building trust and true allyship. So people brought with them a wealth and richness of knowledge working within communities, on the ground, building power within them, but the main points were around capacity building, mostly that we must radically reimagine who is a part of our communities. So this includes often invisibilized Black and Brown Asians, Muslim communities who are often seen as West Asian, sex workers, and more. And we also must build capacity to address white supremacy in institutions so that we can self-determine what we as Asian communities need, including creating paid opportunities to do this work. This also includes recognizing that white supremacy silos us into ethnocultural communities, dividing and ruling us, which is a tactic that has been used again and again to push power back towards the hands of whiteness and make communities of color fight for scraps. A couple of things were mentioned. The needs of community are completely ignored until there's a PR crisis, but the community needs to always be ready to react to this. And then also grassroots organizing and coalition building within the Japanese Canadian community made the achievement of Japanese Canadian redress in the 1980s possible. And then there was also a comment around volunteer experts in Chinatown redesign consultations, which is, I think, a ridiculous thing to ask. We must build capacity to continually do this work so that there aren't peaks and valleys of cyclical knowledge through generations, AKA reinventing the wheel. We must build capacity to pass on knowledge on how to navigate institutions, so things like funding and grant applications, access to civic engagement spaces and cultural work. Build capacity to give space for sticky, often re-traumatizing conversations on identity and belonging, and to make way for healing, so that we don't intentionally re-traumatize ourselves again and again, because that's what white supremacy wants us to do, to keep us in our trauma and to keep us down. We heard from a group in Saskatoon who demonstrated how important this is, who evolved out of a need to collectively grieve all that they were feeling after the Atlanta shootings. So I actually think this event is a really good example of capacity building to first name these needs. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Kimberley. I'm just going to also just add, yes, I think there's also, because it is a very powerful moment, and I'm speaking from UofT, which is currently embroiled in its own specific battle around censure. So in this table that I was a part of as well, we specifically named the Palestinian community, and I would like to say that when we're talking about anti-Asian racism and Asian heritage, we should also include the Palestinian community within this conversation and say that we are also championing their fight as well. Yeah, thank you so much, Kimberley. It was a great table.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, everyone. That was a really important and fascinating set of provocations and ideas. There's a lot on the table now in terms of lessons as well as issues that I invite us to hold on to and think about as we proceed to close off the day, and also into our conversations that will continue to happen, not only tomorrow, and tomorrow is important for sure, but also, in the kind of multiple spin-offs that I hope will take place after this forum, right? Like, really, this forum is meant to be a starting point for conversation, to bring us together, but also to identify opportunities and networks for us to continue to come together. So I really want to thank our panelists for diligently reporting back and for sharing the ideas and summarizing them for us, ideas that came up at your individual tables. And I think for me, at least, it's important to name the fact that I have a lot of questions, and I think, and ideas. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think, by necessity, We cannot solve anti-Asian racism in these 2 days. I wish we can. But the work needs to continue. And part of that work is putting these ideas and issues and difficulties and differences on the table. I think several times today, we've identified the necessity for us to deal with the very categories that we use to come together and what opportunities and barriers that poses, including, for example, the category Asian, its histories, and how it's been shaped by empire and cis-heteronormativity and other such issues. So again, to as well.
Just to respond really quickly to what JP was saying, I myself as well agree that I think one of the best things about what we've done just today in this very packed conference of multiple people speaking on multiple issues is seeing how abundant the category of Asianness and anti-Asian racism is as a topic. And I would say that we gain strength when we hold it this way, when we allow all things to be placed on the table as being relevant to this cause and these issues that we all hold as being like part of our direct issues. So I think like in continuing this work with all the energy that we have, right, this is a moment that we see coming out of, well, terrible mass violence and like mass spectacles of hatred and oppression. The response from the community has been one where everyone seems to be like energized to work and try to like fight oppression and to build new solidarities, build new collaborations, build new coalitions. And I hope that we are able to cultivate that and continue this into the future. And I mean, we're just getting started right now. So yeah.
Indeed, we are only getting started. And, you know, one thing that I want to circle us back to the beginning, the opening panel today, and bring back something that Olivia mentioned in the opening panel on why we are here, which is that alongside naming all of the issues and problems and violence that we face, we also recognize what she calls the galvanizing impulse, the agency, the activism, the creativity. Turn to the generative as one component of the work that is required to deal with and face up to anti-Asian racism. And she also mentioned to me, and this is, she also mentioned, and to me this is really important, that we recognize that we are building on long histories of activism and agency and community organizing. Two, we are not doing this from scratch. Others before us, and all, you know, including folks who are part of this, you know, the conversation that we're having today, right, have been doing this work for a while. So I also wanted to mention that to circle us back to the beginning of today. And on that note, well, thank you and the panelists for listening to us in this report back. And I'll invite Professor Henry Yu to offer some closing comments to close us off for today.
Thanks, JP. Thank you to all the panelists and the moderators and those who came to report back out. We had 8 concurrent panels talking, you know, parallel to each other, and it's actually a wonderful moment to hear all of you bring it together at the end of the day. So I'm here to basically, you know, bring us to a close and to with thank yous to sort of build on JP and Grayson's thank yous to these today's panelists right now, but also over the whole day. We're going to have 100+ speakers over these 2 days, speaking to each other and discussing each other's ideas. And you could say that in some sense, it was the worst of reasons to come together. That this, you know, it's not just been this last year, but as many speakers again and again said, there's long histories of anti-Asian racism, as well as other forms of oppression that we cannot understand. You know, what's going on in the last year, the effects it's been having on our communities, on our families, on ourselves, without that long passing. Faulkner wrote, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And right from that first moment of Elder Larry Grant's welcome to where I am speaking to you from, which is the unceded traditional ancestral territory of Musqueam. It brings home to us that we all live in a past that's not over, that when we often learn in school about, racism in the past, there's always an implication that it's over, that somehow at some magical moment of alchemy, the country stopped being racist, and now it all is good. And that's actually created more of a challenge. And that's come up today, that in fact, even to have to prove that if something happens to you, that it even happened, to prove that there is racism, that you have to dig yourself out of that hole to even start to solve the problem. And so our thanks, again, on behalf of the planning committee, but also the 100+ people that we had. There was a steering committee that came together from across Canada. There was an academic advisory committee that came across Canada, student advisories. There was so many people who have been working so hard to even get to the point where we could have this conversation. And in many ways, that is in itself a huge accomplishment, as several people in this last panel said, which was to have people from different regions, from such a wide variety of backgrounds. People have not met together. Others have worked together over the years. But many people today, this is the first time they've gotten together. That we've had people in different fields perhaps speaking to each other and listening to each other for the first time. And so that coming together, it's for the worst of reasons that we've come together. It's a necessary reason perhaps that we've had to come together, but in coming together from so many different perspectives, and these intersections are only possible if we actually meet people who have very different backgrounds, that we're not even aware in some sense of the particular ways in which we live in the world until we meet so many others. So our thanks on behalf of, again, all of those who came together. Thanks also to those who have come in to listen. And that tomorrow at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, at 5 p.m. East Coast, for those of you who are coming in from, we'll have, again, more public sessions with more reporting back out, and hopefully some of the suggestions that have already come up about next steps, that these we'll keep working on it. And hopefully by the end of tomorrow, we'll have a number of next steps. And we're not going to solve the problem all in 2 days. It may be a generation. The Angus Reid poll, it's very interesting that many Canadians, when they were polled, this is Asian Canadians, non-Asian Canadians, many people saw this as a generational problem, that it would take a generation to solve. But that starts with the first steps. And so if this today was a first step to ending this, then we look forward to the next steps. So thanks again to JP, Grayson, and the others for reporting back from the 8 sectors. And we thank everyone again for all the hard work. I thank all those UBC staff who've been spending their days and nights putting this together. The difficulty and challenge of a virtual conference and forum in this manner, I think no one could even imagine that we could get together like this during COVID, but we have, and that's thanks to the team that have spent, it's a work of passion for most of them. They really cared about this deeply, and you could see in the care that's gone into today. So thank you to everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow for the continuation of this important discussion.